Be here now. Just be here now.
When I got thrown out of Harvard in May of '63, that was a powerful moment in my life because I was doing what I felt to be true. And even though the whole social system was telling me that I was wrong.
Hey everybody, it's Raghu back with Ram Dass Here and Now, another episode. And before I get into it, I just want to call out again, as I've done many times in the last few months, with our great supporter and sponsor of Be Here Now Network, BetterHelp.com. BetterHelp.com is an online therapy platform, and they match people up with therapists according to whatever is needed by by us as individuals. And it's really difficult getting with a therapist in a physical situation for many reasons, mostly demand. So BetterHelp.com absolutely provides a service that's so important for us to be able to get out of ourselves the emotional clogging and anxiety and depression, all of it. To be able to talk to somebody about it is extraordinarily important. So call out to BetterHelp.com. Go to BetterHelp.com/Ramdas and you'll get a discount. The other thing I wanted to mention, which is really in the same line in terms of what are the things that we can do that help us on a day-to-day basis get through some intense times. And the other thing is the Ram Dass Fellowship. And there's many different fellowships, from BIPOC to LGBTQ to there's one in Spanish. We're starting one around business and spirituality with our Google friends. So there's quite a few different themes of people getting together and just being able to share. It's all about satsang community. And we also, on a monthly basis, although this summer we're taking a break in July, I believe, and we'll be back in August, where we get esteemed thought leaders and teachers talking on in different subjects and different themes and explicating them. We just had Sharon Salzberg, by the way. You can go to ramdas.org events. You'll find where you can replay. I mean, Sharon's thing on mindfulness and meditation was phenomenal. Please check it out, and gives you an idea of the kind of experiences that one can have through the fellowship, both in gathering with like-minded people and in being able to partake in these fantastic talks from different teachers, which also has a Q&A component. So do take advantage. These are both things, from BetterHelp.com to Ram Dass Fellowship. You go to ramdas.org/fellowship and you'll get a lot more detailed information. There you go. So this is, I'm just looking at some notes, and they're like, okay, the proposed title is When Acid Meets Beer. I love that. Yeah. So, because this has a lot about what Ram Dass went through at Harvard and getting thrown out and being a good guy, then a bad guy, then back to a good guy once he became a yogi. There's some really, really cool historical stuff, and the way, of course, that Ram Dass characterizes it is precious, absolutely precious. I did want to point out a couple of things, and by the way, some of these things that I do point out, obviously I'm repeating what's in the talk because I feel like these are things to look out for, and they bear repeating. They're really important thoughts and and give birth inside us to other reflections. So here you go. This really, I was there then to the late 60s, early 70s. And of course, many people from that era look back on this, that was just naive bullshit, love and truth and all that. But we did feel, and this is what Ram Dass says, that the inner feeling that love and truth were powerful enough to change this system. And what we captured back then was a return to a sense of innocence, and we just assumed that its power and its truth would ride over everything. Little did we know. And the interesting thing here is with Ram Dass, well, of course, he said love and truth are the realization of it are very frightening to people that have vested interest in things that are based on injustice, inequality, power, right? And the interesting thing that he does say here is that, and he's, I remember talking to him directly about this before he died in the years that he was in Maui. He just that the 60s were a precipitator of what the conservative movement and the fundamentalist movement that is so dividing in this country right now. He said, we entertained the edge of anarchy and chaos as the creative moment in a way that they couldn't handle. It just scared the living you-know-what out of them. And so we are in the center of this right now in terms of, I think I said on a podcast, maybe on Mind Rolling some time back, because I'd heard this aphorism about living in these kinds of times of intense chaos. And the Chinese have this aphorism for it, which is, how did it go? These times are a dangerous opportunity. Isn't it so? Dangerous opportunity. And Ram Dass says, if you're interested in awakening and spiritual awakening, this is the time when Shiva, the god of destruction, really is dancing on everyone's head. This is an extraordinary time for inner work. See if you can keep any sort of equanimity in a situation like this. And also, he addresses the he really in this talk addresses just everything. What's going on with the environment. And here in this particular part, it talks about polarization. I mean, we are so polarized. And that's, he says, what we did in the 60s. We were the good guys with truth and love. They were the bad people with fear and contraction. And he said, that's not good enough anywhere. I have no idea in the world of how we cut through this except in dialogue. And I could only think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the way in which he always says, we are all the same. We want love. We want to be heard. We want compassion. And finding that commonality is our work. Very difficult, very difficult. And he said in this thing, which is why I think it's so amazing, we got a tremendous amount of heaviness in store for us because of environmental, social problems, etc., the breakdown of social system. But it's a creative moment. It's whether or not that's a dark moment or that's the moment of transformation. Transformation isn't a rose garden. So here he is with the full talk and all of the wonderful mapping out through his deep understanding about what we went through back in the day, 60s and 70s, and where we are now. And this talk, I believe, was recorded in, not long before he had his stroke, 94, so just several years before the stroke. He could have been projecting to 2022. He really could have, even though he's not with us for the last couple of years. He knew what was going on. So that's it. That's what's going on here at Be Here Now Network. And this is Ram Dass Here and Now. Go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ram Dass and listen to all of the other wonderful podcasts that we have going on. Check it out. See you next time.
Hello, this is Duncan Campbell, your host on Connections, and as was mentioned earlier, we have a very special guest in the studio with us today, Ram Dass, who is a person that is known to many of you out there, formerly Richard Alpert in a previous incarnation, and someone who's been very influential in my own life since I first met him about 25 years ago. And we thought that today we might take a slightly different and special tack on having him here on the air with us and perhaps revisit some of those days in the 60s when the transformation took place from Richard Alpert, Harvard professor, into Ram Dass, who has now become one of the leading, if not the best known agent, if you will, of communicating the wisdom of the East into the Western culture and forming a kind of interweaving of the two. And so I thought we might start today by recalling, Ram Dass, the time that I first met you, which was when I was in Harvard Law School. And I believe it was in the spring, April of 1969. There was a very small meeting, unpublicized, held in a classroom somewhat off the beaten path at Harvard, where you were appearing for the first time since you'd been fired by the university for the experiments with LSD with Tim Leary 6 years before. And I remember walking into the room. It was about 8:45 at night, and you were sitting cross-legged on the table where the ordinary professors normally sat behind it in a chair, and you were dressed in white, and people were around you, where there were candles, and you began to speak. And that was about 9 o'clock at night, and by the time you'd finished, you had talked until about 3 in the morning. And we were all enthralled, and story after story cascaded out. And all of that ultimately went into print and was shared with thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, as your book, Be Here Now. And I remember walking back to my apartment near Harvard Square about 3:30 in the morning and getting into bed and lying awake for quite a while, thinking that what I had just heard about your experiences in India was truly as marvelous and wondrous as I suppose were the tales of Marco Polo when he first came back to the West. And they certainly were not in our paradigm of Western thinking. But there was something so genuine and so authentic about the way you had said it that I just thought, I've got to somehow meet this man again and pursue this. And so weeks later, I went up to your farm in New Hampshire, your father's farm, where you were camping out, and a number of people would come up and see you every Sunday as you gave darshan, or sermons, I guess we'd call them in the West, and sharing your experience. And so I've always been curious, what it was like for you coming back to Harvard University, that citadel of Western thought, for the first time after 6 years, and beginning a journey that has now been followed literally by hundreds of thousands of us around the U.S. and the world. So maybe a little kind of story about how it felt to come back and what was going on with you that night.
Well, good morning, Duncan, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here. When I got thrown out of Harvard in May of '63, that was a powerful moment in my life, because I was doing what I felt to be true. And even though the whole social system was telling me that I was wrong. And for a few years after that, when I went through Harvard Square, I would get very emotional, because I would rehearse what I had lost. I had lost my tenure and my future and all that. And then I'd run it by against what I was experiencing. And I'd think what I'm experiencing is more valid and true than what I had before. And after about 2 years of grieving, I really got over it. So by the time I had gone to India and tasted something more profound than that, and came back, Harvard was kind of insignificant to me. So coming back that evening was a delight, but kind of an empty form. Tim and I did it again in 1983 on the 20th anniversary of being thrown out. And Dave McClelland, who was the guy that threw us out, introduced us we got Sanders Theater, which it looked like Harvard was sponsoring us. Actually, we just got the theater, so that was different. That was fun. That was fun because it had a kind of a rebellious quality to it.
Well, that's so interesting because I think these are still the same themes that are true for all of us, to pop forward a moment in time before we go back and pick up this theme from the 60s. You and I were both just recently in Killarney, Ireland, last month, May of 94, at the International Transpersonal Association Conference Toward Earth Community, which brought together a number of people from the spiritual disciplines, the psychological disciplines, the science disciplines, political activists, and so on. And Michael Toms of New Directions was there, and I remember in his presentation, he said that if any of you out there are even thinking about leading a kind of life that's not part of the dominant culture, you are already in the margins. And if you are in the margins, that's where the creation of the new paradigm or any kind of transformation is going to come from. And so don't look for confirmation from the dominant culture. That was the main message.
Great.
Yeah, and it was very interesting because it's hard out there when you are seeking truth, as you were then and are now, and the same for many of us. When you start to proclaim the truth that you know in a culture that, in some sense, to use current jargon, is in dysfunctional denial, of course, the change agent is often the object of not only criticism, but often outright hatred.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There was a moment when there was a press conference after I had been thrown out, when all of the press, the television, because I was the first professor thrown out of Harvard in 6,000 years, and there were all these television and interviewers, and I remember they all looked at me as if I had just lost the big fight because I had taken on Harvard, and I was going to end up in the gym sweeping, and I remember that collective feeling that I had lost, and inside the feeling that I had won. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I'm a psychologist. This is psychosis when you think one thing and everybody else thinks something else. But the inner validity of it was so profound that I thought, if this is, then so be it, because this is more true than what it is that they are holding on to as their definition of reality.
Well, that's wonderful that you say that, because I remember I was in Harvard Law School at the time, which was even more than being in Harvard College, a sense of really being at the heart of the establishment linear logical view, and feeling very much the same thing that you felt, that as these other awarenesses were calling to me, that there was a sense, well, it's almost like an either or. Either I'm crazy or they're crazy, and then wanting to transcend that, but having to go through that very difficult transformational moment where, as you put it, you had to find the internal validation in the face of this external non-comprehension. And it reminded me recently of Klaus Nobel at the Earth Summit told me that Schopenhauer was, the philosopher, was fond of saying that truth always emerges in three stages. First, it is ridiculed, then it is violently opposed, and then finally it is embraced by the establishment as its own. And I noted that in October of 1992, Galileo was formally pardoned his heresy by the Catholic Church.
Well, I won't hang, but
that was an item in the New York Times. Yeah.
It's interesting to go from being a good guy, which I was when I was a Harvard professor, then becoming a bad guy, a druggie, then becoming yoga from the East was pretty weird. So I was then a weird guy. And now I'm back being a good guy again. And this is very funny. I mean, I'm now so legitimate. I get invited to all these really conservative conferences. And I figure, listen, share the Dharma wherever the opportunity arises,
That's
but
great.
It's not as much fun being a good guy as a bad guy. I must admit that there is a little fringe benefit in playing with the edge.
Well, actually, I've got a little treat for you today that I pulled out of the few photographs that have survived my moves over the years, from being a straight guy to a hippie guy, back to being a straight guy and a somewhat hippie guy, and that whole kind of thing, in terms of outer form and inner reality. And what I found was a picture of yourself on your father's farm in New Hampshire on the grass out there in 1969, which I thought I'd share with you here.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
There you are,
wow,
the very long hair and in
far
the
out
serape with your white.
Wasn't I pure?
Yeah, you were very pure.
Wasn't I pure?
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Look at me now, how corrupt I've gotten. That's so beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful?
Sure, I'd follow that, man, anywhere.
Yeah. And this was in the days when we'd come up and we'd say, well, gee, Ram Dass, you've come back with all this wisdom from the East. What should we do? And you would say things like, well, what should I tell you? Run around the farm for 3 times and come back and do, sit-ups, And it was very funny. And I also remember at that time, I too was making a transition. And here's my picture, where I was painting the fence down at the foot of the path there at your father's farm, and just beginning to grow the beard there, that ultimately became considerably longer,
Wow.
as did my hair and whatnot. And there, you're right about being the bad guy, in a sense that there was something, kind of invigorating about having a community of other people who were also pushing the edge and exploring it. A number of us went to Woodstock Festival that summer, and that was a big transformative event for me as well, because I just remember that some of the things that were going on there were so extraordinary in terms of the normal paradigm, that I felt that more transformation was happening in that weekend that could happen if I worked for the Alliance for Progress for 20 years,
Yeah.
And one particular moment struck me when Canned Heat was playing in the afternoon, and people started craning their heads, and it turned out that a young woman had taken off all her clothes somewhere down by the hog farm, and people were kind of looking. But then this young man took off his clothes, kind of skinny, and had a big, kind of purple afro, white man, and little glasses. And he just started dancing like Pan throughout the entire crowd of 500,000 people, all the way up to the back and around.
Mm.
And he started coming down through these people who were, drinking beer and had baseball caps and T-shirts and looked like they were, not going to be receptive to this sort of energy. And I remember shying away thinking, oh, this is going to be terrible. And, I hate the sight of blood, And he danced right through magically. And he went all the way down to the stage. By now, he's about 3 or 4 acres away from his clothes. He'll probably never see them again. Canned Heat's playing, he's grooving, everybody's grooving. And I thought, this is really extraordinary.
Yeah.
This example of letting go.
It's when acid meets beer.
That's good. That's very good. Yeah.
It was it was something that you and I had talked about before, which was the inner feeling that love and truth were powerful enough to change the system, and that the purity of that kid at that moment, he was doing something that children can do and then adults can't do. He was doing that thing that was innocent. And what we captured back in the 60s was a return to a sense of innocence. And we just assumed that its power and its truth would ride over everything. Little did we know.
Little did we know. And I think that's actually kind of the interesting segue into what did happen after that. I remembered how, as you put it, looking at your picture, how pure you were in those days. And in a sense, we all had that kind of Parsifal purity of heart of, questing for our truth and for truths, and thinking that if only we could bring that back into the public sphere and proclaim it, that there would be a kind of general celebration of the culture, and we would all transform together. And yet, of course, as we know, things turned out very differently. And it seems to be taking not only considerably longer, but now the question is, what will happen? I remember when I was in Russia on August 20th, on the night of August 20th, on the barricades in Moscow. I just happened to find myself there historically, and how powerful the celebration was the following day, being outside the White House, hearing truth emanating from the speakers way, way up on the balcony, and people actually smiling and laughing in the street below all around me, when in Moscow for 10 days before that, people didn't even look at one another in the eye. And there was this wonderful, powerful sense that consciousness was expanding and it was going to move out. And here we are 3 years later with a kind of sense of deflation of that energy. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, in a way, I think it's a very interesting moment. Prague was an example of this. I came the year after Prague was free again, and the joy and the artists out and the musicians, and it all felt like it was going to happen again. And then a year later, when I went back, the economic realities had struck, and there was a kind of a depression, and the deeper cultural personality structures had emerged once again after the kind of euphoria of the transcendent moment had passed. So what do I hear now? First of all, I think that it isn't innocent now. And I don't think it's naive like it was in the 60s. I think the realization is that truth and love are very frightening to people that have vested interests in things that are based on injustice, inequality, a whole lot of issues. And that everybody isn't going to roll over, because if you haven't had the experiences that validated the true power of truth and love, you were still motivated by fear, and you were going to do the best you could to hold on to your stash and play king of the mountain. And I think that we in the 60s were as much a precipitator of the right, the conservative movement and the fundamentalist movement, as the conservatives were. I mean, I think we entertained the edge of anarchy and chaos as the creative moment in a way that they couldn't handle, that it just scared the living everything out of them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting, because that pendulum swing, which went for 20 years now, mm-hmm. is now coming back again. But the predicament is whether the kind of liberal or whether liberalism and truth and love are the same thing or not. And that's the issue with Clinton and that whole scene in the White House at the moment.
Very much so, yeah.
It's like, did we make it finally? Mm-hmm. And but it's interesting.
Or has it been co-opted by the system so thoroughly that we don't even recognize it anymore?
Well, it's an interesting moment. I was writing to a fellow named Dreyer, who writes speeches for Clinton in the White House. And I said, is there any space in the scene at all? Is there any reflectiveness, or is everybody reactive? Is there any... Are there any people that don't have power capacities, that are just there to hold the vision or give space? And he wrote back and he described what it was like there. And it was like being in a Vietnam foxhole. And I was like saying, are you having Buddhist meditations when these people were dodging whitewater and this and that and all these bullets coming at them all day long? And it was really interesting. I realized that if we wanted to play with worldly power, we had to be so disciplined and ready to do that we could handle those kinds of forces when they came, the Bob Doles and all of them, all these kinds of things.
Who cried at Nixon's wedding.
Yeah.
I mean, his funeral.
His funeral, yes. Yeah. So my sense is we are much tougher now, and we're much more ready to deal with the realities of this. I'm working to deal with the kind of centrist position of Clinton without closing down my heart to the possibility of change. And I think it's a tougher, more interesting time. The energies are much higher. It's much more scary because of the environmental imminence, the kind of way we're destroying the environment. These are all forces that we didn't realize back in the 60s. We only had the bomb then. Now we've got the bomb plus all these things. So if you're interested in awakening, in spiritual awakening, this time when Shiva's really dancing, this is an extraordinary time for that inner work, to see if you can keep any deal of equanimity at all in a situation like this.
Especially when you try to take your truth into the outer or civic sphere and you run into exactly what you're talking about, the kind of intensity of response of the consciousness that is invested in stasis. Gene Houston likes to talk about the evolution of consciousness and of society going from stasis to hyperstasis before it then goes into kinesis and then hyperkinesis when the actual transformation takes place.
That's interesting.
And then back to stasis, so that in a sense, at the moment just before the change, things are going to rigidify and become even more hostile to what are, from our point of view, seemingly innocent, straightforward statements about, well, if we're going to get well, we first have to acknowledge that something's wrong here, and here are some things that are not entirely straightforward, that have been deceptive, whether by design or by unconsciousness, and we need to first realize what's true. And then we can start moving to make the appropriate changes. And then by being the spokesman for truth, just like Schopenhauer says, first the response is ridicule, and then second, violently.
But I'll tell you, I think that we got to watch those metaphors a little bit, because this time around, either everybody goes or nobody goes. It's not enough to polarize again. That's what we did in the 60s. We were the good guys with truth and love, and they were the bad people with fear and contraction. And that's not good enough anymore, really. And I think that that whatever that, like I have on my puja table, my little holy table, a picture of Bob Dole. And every morning, I say, good morning to Buddha and Christ and my guru and mother and Ananda my ma and all these things. And then I say, hello, Bob. And I can watch my heart contract when I say that, and I see how much work I have to do to keep him a member of our family. Because if the family doesn't hang together at this point, everybody goes down. That's what, at this point, it's the tobacco industry versus the, it's the good guys and the bad guys, and that's not good enough.
Well, I think, a lot of us have, sort of gone beyond the good guys and the bad guys notion in terms of view. But still, it's very difficult, even if you come at the public realm with the attitude that you've just described, not to evoke, an oppositional or confrontational response, much as, Machiavelli just described the process by saying that if you're a change agent, and interestingly enough, this was quoted by someone at the university who recently, had some difficulties in his administration over there at the business school, and ideas that he wanted to bring in terms of change were not received well, and there was a lot of controversy. And he quoted Machiavelli saying that when you're an agent of change, the people that may benefit from the change that you're proposing are very slow to come to your support because, in part, they're not even clear that it is in their benefit yet. And the people who feel that they're in the least bit threatened will immediately and with tremendous hostility try to crush any movement in that direction. So even if your intentionality is to keep in the family, if Bob Dole perceives, that something's happening here.
This is about two levels of consciousness. I mean, at one level, you oppose somebody, but there's a way, like when Gandhi said, the British have to leave India, but I want them to leave as friends. There are different levels of play with other human beings, and you can get into an us relationship with people and then say us has to face that at this point, it's you against me. But if you've established some other level of connection with a person, and I think that's where we may make stands, but how we make the stand is the issue. And whether we close our hearts. So learning how to say no to somebody without closing your heart to them is a very, very profound spiritual teaching.
And I think that's, in a sense, really all we can do as individuals. And then our fate will either turn out to be that of Gandhi or that of Christ, that of Gandhi or that of Martin Luther King. Because certainly Martin Luther King and Christ, held the same value of nonviolence and nonpolarization. And yet, as Albert Schweitzer said about Jesus, that incredible metaphor that Jesus pushed his shoulder against the wheel again and again, and it did not move until finally he threw his whole body on the wheel. And as it incrementally began to move and turn, it crushed him underneath.
That's a great image.
Yeah.
Wow. Who's that? Schweitzer?
That was Albert Schweitzer, quoted by Michael Ventura in his piece last year in the LA Weekly on Christ.
Boy, I'd never think Schweitzer would come out with something that good.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So in a sense, one adopts that view of trying to create equanimity and to be able to survive the even unintentional or unaware controversy or confrontation that the truth itself can evoke. And then
really
we see what the outcome
second
is.
Level, Duncan. It's you do something and then somebody reacts, and then what you do next is interesting. And how deep your equanimity and connection to your truth is depends on how loving that next response can be. Mm-hmm. These aren't one action.
Right.
They're sequences of actions, and they can de-escalate the affect or they can have increments of affect.
And that, in a sense, I guess, is a beautiful expression of the new definition, we might say, of the path in the 90s, because looking back on it, of our kind of pristine and rather pure naivete, it's almost like Blake's Songs of Innocence, then Songs of Experience, and Songs of Innocence Regained. And we've been through the experience, the wars, as it were, in the last 20 years. And I remember just a funny story here when I was, again, at Harvard Law School, just right after I met you. I remember we were up several times to visit with you on your father's farm, and I even did that 10-day or 9-day fast over Rosh Hashanah with you and so on. And I came back and I thought, this man, Ram Dass, has, by his journey and sharing it with me, saved me perhaps 10 years of exploration, which might have gone further into LSD or other vehicles that now it seemed like we could short circuit with meditation. You have that formulation that, if you take an external chemical in order to induce a state of openness to the universe, that you do go up, but then, of course, you come down. And the suggestion was if you did a more organic practice like meditation, you could gradually, incrementally sustain a movement of consciousness which could flower and unfold like the lotus over time. And so I remember reading in Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy that there were 3 ways that you could get to that sense of openness or unfiltered enlightenment, seeking truth. One was hallucinogenics. The second was meditation. And the third was understanding the cognitive structures and imprints that arrive very quickly as we enter into life. So I looked through the Harvard catalog, which was about 2 or 3 inches thick, for a course that I could take as my elective at Harvard Law School to complete my journey, having tried the other 2 poles of the tripod. And I found something in the psychology department that said cognitive structures, said so on and so forth. So I went to the instructor, who turned out to be a graduate student. And I told him I wanted to take the course, and he looked at me somewhat baffled, and he said, well, no, why are you wanting to sign up for this course? You know, you're in the law school. What are you looking for? And without any irony, I earnestly said, truth. And he looked at me totally bewildered. And he was literally speechless. And then he said, well, maybe you should try the philosophy department.
That's great. That's great. That's great.
And it was a wonderful moment, because he was completely ironically, earnest and unintentional. And I realized that, there was something very powerful right here in the citadel of the search for truth of the great Harvard University, which was the power of the social system, the need to survive, the need to have a job, the need to write a monograph, and somehow that search for the essence. More
interesting, Duncan, was that the Harvard was full of the high priests of the intellect, and the assumption that the intellect is privy to special truth is a fallacy. And I was basically coming on to a tennis court with football cleats.
Ram Dass, hold that thought. We've got to go to a special test at this moment. We'll be right back with you. Ram Dass, let's pick up again after this test of official information. You were saying about the privileged position of the intellect and what that means in our culture.
I think that Harvard was right to throw me out, because I was going on to a tennis court with football cleats. That non-conceptual, the truth doesn't have form. When you come into form, you're coming into relative truth. And if you're searching for truth and you touch it with being. You don't touch it with knowing. And Harvard had no place in that institution for that kind of wisdom as opposed to knowledge. And it was very threatening to the high priesthood of the temple of knowledge. So that was the issue around truth. The question is whether truth is an identity with analytic intellectual mind or not.
Well, that's extremely interesting that you say that, because what I see coming up is it's a question of skillful means. That in fact, in the beginning, there was a certain kind of naivete. There was not an intention to necessarily provoke or épater le bourgeois, although that might have mixed in there a little later. There was just a sense of, well, this is so interesting, I want to share this, and not realizing how threatening that could be to someone. And what I'm reminded of is Gregory Bateson came here to Naropa Institute in 1974, the same summer you were here, and you and I did that wonderful panel with Trungpa Rinpoche and John Baker and Jim Green on psychology, East and West. And I also did an interview that summer with Gregory Bateson, and he told me a beautiful story like yours of being at Oxford and finding the place somewhat rigid and sterile and claustrophobic. And so he took a year off, and he went off to Dutch New Guinea or whatever the island was, and he worked in the native culture for a year. And he found himself, and he opened up and became a kind of authentic, integrated being. And he came back with great joy to Oxford to complete his studies. And he was at the table with the Dons having dinner. And in his eagerness to sort of share his newfound truth, he turned to one of the Dons and spoke about how interesting this is, all the cutlery that's laid out in this great formality, and the dignity and the form of this that I used to find so sterile is actually, in its own way, the same kind of purity of the form that I found with the simple people on the island and whatnot. And he unwittingly broke the code of silence, about observing the form. And for the rest of the dinner, he was completely ostracized and ignored by the Dons. And he realized that unwittingly he had broken a taboo.
Oh, beautiful.
And then from that point on, he tried to bring his knowledge back in a way in which it could be heard.
It's a great story. Yeah, right on. Same thing.
Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the conference you and I were at in Killarney. You had a very, very interesting statement there about what may happen in the future. I remember 25 years ago, we all had a certain amount of optimism, as we've said, that if we all focused together and we got some of the information out, like, for instance, the information on the Vietnam War and truth-telling and so on, ultimately we would prevail and the culture would voluntarily shift to a more community, intimacy-based, celebratory kind of style. And of course, that hasn't happened. In fact, recently, Cornel West, wrote in Newsweek about the 80s that the Reagan administration not only signaled the predominance of market culture values for America, but it was the beginning of what's now happening worldwide with the GATT and NAFTA, where economic, tangible values are becoming the rock paradigm of the society, and the human values of intimacy or community, spiritual fulfillment, personal growth are having to adapt to these kind of values.
That's just a stage, Duncan. I mean, it's a stage like communism was a stage, because basically it's inherently unstable. It's not dealing with the truth of the human heart. So ultimately, it's got to change. I mean, we're just watching the agony of the process,
the hyperstasis
of the mind versus the heart, if you will, or whatever you want to call that thing. Yeah.
But nonetheless, I recall you're saying at Killarney that you were feeling that perhaps we've got some real social turmoil to go through in order to get to that breakthrough. And you told a story, I believe, of an Indian teacher you asked about the future.
Yeah.
Would you share that with us?
I didn't ask him. He was dead by the time I came to India. He died much earlier. But at one point, somebody asked him, what's the future going to be like? He said, there will come a time when you will walk 5 miles and you'll see a light, a firelight, and you'll be so happy to know that another human being still exists. And that really chilled my blood when I heard that one. I mean, without going that far, at least we've got the awareness that the course we're on and the inertia is like cattle running to the edge of the cliff. We've got a tremendous amount of heaviness in store for us because of environment, social problems, etc., breakdown of social systems. But that's all a creative moment. I mean, it's whether or not that's a dark moment or that's the moment of transformation. Transformation isn't a rose garden, but it's, and that's why I said at that lecture that our work now as conscious people attempting to be conscious is to prepare to be able to stay stable in the presence of intense change and chaos. Because that's when the one-eyed man is king, or whatever, or the one-eyed white woman is queen.
The end of the silly monkey, as Terence McKenna says, or whatever, And so whatever eventuates, working on oneself in that particular way, you'll be prepared for...
you'll really be useful at that moment. It's like preparing to play a part.
Just like Václav Havel did, interestingly enough, in the Dark Ages, when it seemed there was no light at the end of the tunnel, he and his friends practiced democracy in private, electing each other to things. It was quite a beautiful story.
He's a very, very fine role model, by the way, of a conscious politician.
I think so. One of the very few.
He and the Dalai Lama are the two outstanding political figures in the world today.
This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and ramdas.org. We appreciate you listening, and we appreciate all the support that you've given us. Please continue that support and donate at ramdas.org. We can then continue to share what Ram Dass has been sharing for all of these years. Thank you.